When the air raid sirens wailed across London on September 7, 1940, factory worker Robert Thompson grabbed his wife Margaret and their 2 children, racing toward the nearest underground station as the first German bombers appeared in the evening sky. For 76 consecutive nights, the Thompson family would face Hitler's attempt to break British morale through terror bombing of civilian targets. But the secret that held their family together through unimaginable horror would reveal the true strength of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil. Could you maintain hope when death rained from the sky every single night? The Blitz began with the sound that Londoners would never forget, the deep, menacing drone of hundreds of German aircraft approaching the city like mechanical locusts. From their small house in Bermondsey, near the London docks, Robert could see the first wave of Heinkel bombers passing overhead in tight formation, their black silhouettes stark against the September sunset. Margaret clutched 8-year-old Susan and 10-year-old David as the family huddled in their Anderson shelter, a corrugated steel structure buried in their back garden that the government had provided to protect civilians from bomb blasts. The shelter was cramped, cold, and damp, but it represented their only chance of survival when the bombs began falling. The first explosions came from the direction of the Thames docks, where German strategists had targeted the warehouses and shipping facilities that kept Britain supplied with food and war materials. The ground shook with each detonation, and through the shelter's small window, the Thompson family could see an orange glow spreading across the London skyline as fires consumed entire city blocks. Robert, who worked as a crane operator at the Surrey commercial docks, understood immediately what the Germans were trying to accomplish. By destroying London's port facilities, they hoped to strangle the city's lifeline and force Britain to negotiate a surrender. But what Hitler's planners hadn't anticipated was the determination of ordinary families like the Thompsons to endure whatever horror was necessary to preserve their freedom. Could you find courage to protect your children when the very air around you became a weapon of war? The bombing continued for 11 straight hours that first night, with wave after wave of German aircraft dropping high explosive bombs and incendiaries on civilian areas throughout London. The Thompson family spent the entire night in their shelter, listening to the whistle of falling bombs, the crash of explosions, and the distant sounds of fire engines and ambulances racing through streets that looked like scenes from hell. When dawn finally came on September 8th, the family emerged to find their neighborhood transformed. Houses that had stood for generations were reduced to smoking rubble. The local school where Susan and David had attended classes just days before was gone, replaced by a crater filled with broken brick and twisted metal. Most heartbreaking of all, several of their neighbors' homes had been destroyed, and the fate of the families inside remained unknown. Margaret's first instinct was to pack the children and flee to the countryside, where relatives in Somerset had offered shelter until the bombing stopped. But Robert understood that abandoning London would mean abandoning his job at the docks, work that was crucial to Britain's war effort and their family's economic survival. The decision they made that morning would define their experience for the next 11 months. Rather than flee, the Thompson family chose to stay and adapt, developing survival routines that would help them endure one of the most sustained civilian bombardments in military history. The choice required them to balance rational fear with practical necessity, finding ways to maintain normal family life while living under constant threat of sudden death. But the real shock came when they realized the bombing would continue every single night. Hitler's strategy for the London Blitz was based on psychological warfare rather than purely military objectives. German leaders believed that sustained terror bombing of civilian targets would break British morale and force the government to seek peace terms before American aid could become decisive. The campaign was methodical and relentless. Every evening around sunset, German bomber formations would cross the English Channel and begin their nightly assault on London. The attacks followed predictable patterns. First came the Pathfinder aircraft that dropped incendiary bombs to mark targets, then the main bomber force that delivered high-explosive ordnance designed to destroy buildings and kill civilians. For the Thompson family, this predictability became a blessing and a curse. They could prepare for each night's bombing, gathering supplies and moving to their shelter before the raids began. But they also had to live with the knowledge that every sunset brought renewed danger, and that survival depended on luck as much as preparation. The psychological pressure was enormous, especially on the children. Susan developed a stutter that would persist for years after the war, while David began having nightmares that left him unable to sleep peacefully. Margaret struggled with anxiety that made her jump at every unexpected sound, constantly fearing that German bombers might return during daylight hours. Robert coped by focusing on practical tasks, reinforcing their shelter, organizing neighborhood watch duties, and maintaining his equipment at the docks despite frequent bombing damage to port facilities. Work provided structure and purpose that helped him avoid dwelling on dangers beyond his control. What would you do to preserve your children's innocence when the world around them was consumed by violence and destruction? The Thompson family developed elaborate routines designed to make their shelter feel like a temporary home rather than a tomb. Margaret packed books, games, and small toys that could help distract the children during the long hours of bombing. Robert installed a small battery-powered radio that provided news updates and occasional music between air raid warnings. Most importantly, they created family traditions that gave structure to their underground existence. Every night in the shelter, Margaret would tell stories about happier times, family vacations to Brighton, Christmas celebrations with grandparents, and plans for adventures they would have after the war ended. These stories became lifelines that connected their present suffering to hopes for a better future. The children adapted with the remarkable resilience that young people often display in crisis situations. Susan learned to read at candlelight, working through adventure novels that transported her imagination far from the bombs falling overhead. David became fascinated by aircraft identification, using Robert's engineering knowledge to understand the technical differences between German bombers and British fighters. But adaptation came at a psychological cost that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. The constant stress of living under bombardment affected the entire family's mental health in ways that seemed manageable during the crisis, but would require years of recovery after the war ended. The physical dangers were immediate and obvious, but the emotional trauma was cumulative and largely invisible until long after the bombing stopped. You won't believe the act of kindness that restored the family's faith in human goodness during their darkest hour. On October 15, 1940, a particularly heavy bombing raid destroyed 3 houses on the Thompson Street, including the home of their elderly neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson. The explosion occurred just after midnight when most families were already in their shelters, but the Pattersons had been delayed by Mrs. Patterson's arthritis, which made it difficult for her to move quickly. Robert and several other neighbors rushed to the destroyed house as soon as the bombing moved to other areas of the city. They could hear voices calling for help from beneath the rubble, but the debris was too heavy and unstable for untrained civilians to move safely. The rescue took 6 hours of careful work by professional emergency crews, but both Pattersons were pulled from the wreckage alive, though seriously injured. Mrs. Patterson had a broken leg and several cracked ribs, while Mr. Patterson suffered a severe head injury that left him unconscious for several days. With their home destroyed and no relatives in London, the elderly couple faced the prospect of being evacuated to an overcrowded emergency shelter where medical care would be minimal and living conditions harsh. The official response was efficient but impersonal. The Pattersons would be processed through the system like thousands of other bombing victims. But Margaret Thompson made a decision that surprised even her own family. Despite their cramped living conditions and limited resources, she insisted that the Pattersons move in with them until better arrangements could be made. The decision seemed illogical from a practical standpoint. The Thompson house was already crowded. Food rationing made feeding additional people difficult, and caring for injured elderly guests would add stress to an already overwhelming situation. Wait a moment. What hidden strength would emerge from this act of compassion during humanity's darkest time? The Pattersons' presence in the Thompson household created unexpected benefits that none of them had anticipated. Mrs. Patterson, despite her injuries, was an experienced seamstress who could repair and alter clothing that had become impossible to replace due to wartime rationing. Her skills helped the entire family maintain decent appearances despite the economic hardships of the war. Mr. Patterson, once he recovered from his head injury, proved to be a gifted storyteller whose accounts of life in London during World War I provided historical perspective that helped everyone understand their current struggles. His experiences during the earlier conflict demonstrated that civilian populations had endured similar hardships and emerged stronger. Most importantly, caring for the elderly couple gave the Thompson children a sense of purpose that helped them cope with their own fears and uncertainties. Susan took responsibility for reading to Mrs. Patterson during her recovery, while David helped Mr. Patterson with physical therapy exercises that gradually restored his mobility. The arrangement also provided practical security benefits. Having 4 adults in the house meant that someone was always available to respond to emergencies, maintain blackout procedures, and coordinate with neighborhood wardens who organized civilian defense activities. But the real value of the Pattersons' presence was emotional rather than practical. Their gratitude and resilience reminded the Thompson family that they were part of a larger community of people who were all facing the same dangers and making the same sacrifices for the same cause. The sense of shared purpose and mutual support created bonds that lasted long after the war ended, transforming what had begun as a temporary emergency arrangement into a permanent extension of the Thompson family. Unbelievable as it seems, the family's greatest test would come not from German bombs, but from an unexpected personal crisis. In December 1940, Robert was injured in an accident at the docks when German bombing damaged the crane he was operating. Shrapnel from a delayed action bomb that exploded during the day shift caught him in the leg and shoulder, requiring hospitalization and several weeks of recovery that left him unable to work. The injury couldn't have come at a worse time for the family's finances. Robert's dock wages were essential for paying rent, buying food, and maintaining their household during a period when most civilian goods were rationed or completely unavailable. Without his income, the Thompsons faced the prospect of losing their home just as the bombing campaign was reaching its peak intensity. Margaret, who had never worked outside the home since her marriage, was forced to find employment in a munitions factory that produced ammunition for British forces fighting in North Africa. The work was dangerous, with constant risk of explosions from the volatile chemicals used in bomb and shell production, but it paid enough to cover basic family expenses. The new arrangement required massive adjustments in family routines. Margaret worked 12-hour shifts at the factory, often returning home exhausted just as air raid sirens began wailing. The children took on additional responsibilities for household management, shopping with ration bulks, and caring for the still recovering Pattersons. Robert struggled with frustration at his temporary inability to contribute to the family's economic survival. His injuries healed slowly, complicated by poor nutrition and the stress of nightly bombing raids that prevented adequate rest. The psychological impact of feeling helpless while his wife and children carried burdens that should have been his responsibility created depression that lasted long after his physical recovery. What you've seen is nothing. The most dangerous night of the entire Blitz was yet to come. May 10, 1941, brought the heaviest bombing raid of the entire Blitz campaign. Over 500 German aircraft attacked London in waves throughout the night, dropping more than 700 tons of high explosive bombs and thousands of incendiary devices that started over 2,000 fires across the city. The Thompson family's neighborhood was hit particularly hard because of its proximity to the Thames docks and railway lines that the Germans considered high-priority military targets. The bombing was so intense that their Anderson shelter shook constantly, and several times they feared that direct hits on nearby houses would collapse their own refuge. The most terrifying moment came around 2 a.m. when an unexploded bomb landed in the garden just 20 feet from their shelter. The device, weighing over 1,000 pounds, had buried itself so deep in the soft earth that only its tail fins were visible above ground. But everyone in the shelter could hear the ominous ticking of the delayed action fuse that would eventually detonate the massive explosive charge. The family faced an impossible choice. They could remain in their shelter, which provided protection from bomb fragments and building debris, but would offer no defense against a direct explosion 20 feet away. Or they could attempt to reach another shelter several blocks away, crossing streets that were being continuously bombed by German aircraft still overhead. Robert made the decision to move, understanding that their current position was certain death if the bomb exploded, but that running through the bombing raid at least gave them a chance of survival. The journey to safety became the most harrowing experience of their entire war. Carrying the injured Mrs. Patterson while supporting Mr. Patterson and guiding the children through streets filled with fire, smoke, and falling debris required courage that Robert didn't know he possessed. Yet could any family maintain such determination when death seemed inevitable from every direction? The half-mile journey to the public shelter took over an hour of careful movement between bomb craters, around burning buildings, and past emergency crews working frantically to rescue victims trapped in collapsed structures. The children showed remarkable courage, following their parents' instructions without complaint despite the chaos erupting around them. Twice during the journey, they had to take shelter in doorways when the bombing became too intense to continue moving. The sound of aircraft engines, exploding bombs, and collapsing buildings created a symphony of destruction that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The most dangerous moment occurred when they were crossing a main road just as a stick of bombs fell across their path. The explosions were so close that the blast waves knocked everyone to the ground, and for a few terrifying seconds, Robert thought the entire family had been killed. But somehow, miraculously, everyone survived without serious injury. The bombs had fallen in a pattern that left narrow gaps between the craters, and the Thompson family had been moving through one of those gaps at the exact moment of impact. When they finally reached the public shelter, a converted underground station that housed over 1,000 civilians, they found a community of Londoners who had been through similar experiences and understood exactly what the family had endured. The shared experience of surviving extreme danger created bonds between strangers that would last for decades after the war ended. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the Blitz campaign ended, leaving the Thompson family to rebuild their lives from the ruins. The last major bombing raid occurred on May 11, 1941, after which German attention shifted to the invasion of the Soviet Union. For 266 nights, London had endured sustained bombing that killed over 43,000 civilians and destroyed or damaged millions of homes, schools, churches, and businesses. The Thompson family emerged from their underground existence to find their neighborhood transformed beyond recognition. Streets they had known since childhood were gone, replaced by rubble-filled lots where familiar buildings once stood. The local shops, schools, and community centers that had anchored their social life required years to rebuild. But they had survived, and survival itself felt like victory against an enemy that had tried to break their spirit through terror and destruction. The psychological resilience they had developed during the bombing campaign became a permanent part of their family character, influencing how they approached challenges for the rest of their lives. Robert returned to work at the docks, where he helped rebuild the port facilities that would be crucial for supplying the D-Day invasion 3 years later. Margaret continued working at the munitions factory until the war ended, using her earnings to help restore their bomb-damaged home and build savings for their children's future education. The Pattersons remained part of the Thompson household permanently, creating an extended family structure that provided mutual support and shared resources during the difficult years of post-war reconstruction. Could such ordinary people truly comprehend the historical significance of their extraordinary endurance? The London Blitz represented more than just a military campaign. It was a test of whether democratic societies could maintain their values and social cohesion when faced with systematic attempts to terrorize civilian populations. The Thompson family's survival, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of similar families, demonstrated that ordinary people possessed reserves of courage and determination that totalitarian leaders had failed to understand. Their daily acts of kindness, mutual support, and stubborn refusal to abandon their community became part of a larger victory that was as important as any military success. By maintaining their humanity in the face of inhuman attacks, London families like the Thompsons proved that democracy's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or technology, but in the character of the people who chose to defend it. The children who grew up during the Blitz carried lessons about resilience, community cooperation, and the importance of helping others that influenced British society for generations. Susan Thompson became a teacher who specialized in helping children cope with trauma, while David pursued engineering studies that led to a career in reconstruction and urban planning. The London that emerged from the Blitz was different from the city that had entered it, more egalitarian, more community-minded, and more determined to create a society that would prevent such suffering from recurring. The shared experience of surviving together had broken down many of the class and social barriers that had previously divided British society. Margaret and Robert Thompson lived to see their grandchildren grow up in a London that was safer, more prosperous, and more democratic than the city they had defended during those dark nights of 1940 and 1941. The sacrifices they had made, the courage they had shown, and the community bonds they had forged had contributed to creating a better world for future generations. The Blitz ended with Hitler's strategic failure to break British morale, but it also marked the beginning of a social transformation that would reshape British society in ways that the bombing's architects never anticipated. The people who survived those 266 nights of terror emerged with a deeper understanding of their own strength and a commitment to building a society worthy of the sacrifices they had endured. Today, the London Underground stations that served as bomb shelters display plaques commemorating the courage of ordinary families who refused to surrender their city to fascist intimidation. The Thompson family story, repeated thousands of times with different names and details, represents the civilian heroism that was as crucial to Allied victory as any military campaign. Their legacy reminds us that in humanity's darkest hours, the greatest heroes are often not soldiers or leaders, but ordinary people who choose to maintain their compassion, protect their families, and support their communities regardless of the personal cost. Would you have found the same strength to persevere when hope seemed impossible and survival uncertain? Their story demonstrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what is right despite being afraid. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to discover more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things during history's most challenging moments.